1943, Kai Islands, Indonesia. In the 1940s, a group of Japanese soldiers stationed on the small section of islands in the Pacific Ocean would come to have sightings of strange aquatic beings. These beings walked the line of both human and fish, and while the Japanese soldiers couldn't begin to fathom what they were seeing, what these soldiers would describe would be one just such example that we have in the massive category that is the legend of mermaids. Aquatic human-fish hybrids said to reside in oceans all over the world. Mostly associated with fantasy and legends from explorers of the open ocean, does the sheer number of sightings point to a much larger phenomenon? Is it possible that mermaids or some iteration of an aquatic humanoid-like creature truly could be real? Today on Unblurring the Unknown, we explore a collection of mermaid sightings and dive into perhaps one of the oldest legends in recorded human history, one in which transcends legend and folklore and into pop culture and even society itself. What are mermaids, and could it be possible that they truly do exist beyond the pages of fiction? Today, we explore and try to understand the legend of mermaids. Welcome back to Unblurring the Unknown. As always, I am your host, Dominic, and first I want to thank you for checking out the show. If you are listening on either Spotify or YouTube, I first want to say thank you for checking out the show. It helps me out a bunch. If you're listening to this on YouTube, please like, comment, subscribe, and give me a follow as well. It helps me out greatly, and I cannot thank you enough. If you're listening to this on Spotify, please turn on post notifications so you get notified every time I release a new episode. And again, I greatly appreciate it. And while you're at it, feel free to follow me over on Instagram and TikTok at the same handle, Unblurring the Unknown, to stay fully up to date on all things this podcast and this show. Now, today on the show, we are covering a topic that has sat for quite some time in my episodes list, or rather my episode queue, and it has sat there since basically the inception of this show, collecting dust until this week. Now, this is also a topic that my girlfriend has wanted me to do for the longest time. She bugged me about this episode and doing this episode more than possibly she bugged me about the glitter conspiracy episode quite a ways back. And she bugged me quite a bit about that one, but this one she has easily bugged me the most about, so I know that she is going to be personally excited for this week's episode. However, when it comes to mermaids, I personally have always been a skeptic. Perhaps that is because I have never extensively dived into the legends or the supposed sightings of mermaids, but something about them never really sat with me along the lines of it being fact rather than fiction. I think that is because we so often associate mermaids with fantasy stories of giant ocean monsters and creatures that early ocean explorers claimed to see, and them claiming to see these half-human, half-fish entities back when they were originally sailing the globe for the first time. However, overall, this is a very broad topic, so I'm going to try and put the episode out and format it in a way that covers mermaids as a whole, and as kind of maybe a little bit as a broad topic. And how we're going to do this is that we're going to talk about some famous sightings, we're going to talk about some folklore, some history in there. We're going to talk very briefly about the Fiji mermaid. If you're unfamiliar with the Fiji mermaid, that's possibly one of the best examples of kind of a sideshow hoax of a cryptid that we possibly have in human existence. So we're going to talk about all those little things, some other tidbits of information I was able to dig up for this episode, and then go into theories, and then wrap it all up with my own personal thoughts and my theories and my opinions on the case for and against mermaids. But with that all being said, let's dive into today's episode. Now, before we go in and talk about some present-day and historical sightings of mermaids, we need to talk about the origins of the mermaid legend, which means we are going to talk about some mythology here of different historical groups and the different stories that we have for the existence of mermaids. Now, many people might originally claim that the first mermaid sighting that we have recorded, perhaps most notably, would come from the mouth of Christopher Columbus. Now, I believe I talked to you about my personal thoughts and feelings on Christopher Columbus in a previous episode, so you already know how I feel about him overall. But nevertheless, let's stay on track here. But many people who might not be familiar with the origin of mermaids would think that this would be, the case, and while we're going to talk about Columbus's sighting in today's episode, you would be wrong. Christopher Columbus did not have the first recorded encounter with a mermaid, and in fact, the legends and mythology date back much further than that, and I'm talking much, much further than that. Perhaps the earliest known iteration of a mermaid would be described by the ancient Babylonians during the 5000 BC time frame. The Babylonians worshipped a god named, I'm pretty sure I'm going to pronounce this A, and it's spelled E-A, but also sometimes referred to as Enki. A was the god of worship, fresh water, crafts, magic, and creation. In Babylonian mythology, A is sometimes described as possessing the body of a half man and half fish, and although A is not a traditional mermaid that we would normally think of, it seems like he is the earliest depiction of a human with fish characteristics. Now, fun fact, the description of A being half man, half fish, and actually with goat-like features, is actually the inspiration for the astrology sign Capricorn. The more you know. Fast forward to the year 1000 BC, in the region of Assyria, which is now modern-day Syria and Iraq. Within Assyrian folklore is the goddess Atargatis, and I hope I pronounced that, Atargatis. The goddess of fertility would be perhaps the closest resemblance to a mermaid that we would have up to this point. She was regularly depicted as a half-human, half-fish entity. Atargatis was not a mermaid by default, though, as mythology claims she transformed into one after casting herself into a lake in an attempt to drown herself after the accidental death of her human lover. Now, Atargatis would never be able to fully become either or, and was able to keep her beauty from the waist up. This legend of Atargatis would change over time and would be adapted by the Greeks, who would often refer to her as Deserto instead. And from this point forward, the Greek mythology would greatly expand on the idea of mermaids in mythology. Now, in Greek mythology, you have multiple legends of what we would consider to be mermaids, and these could be found, like I said, all throughout Greek mythology. You have the Nereids, water and sea nymphs, which were represented by beautiful women who were adorned with opulent crowns and sang within the ocean waters. You had Triton, the Greek god of the sea, is often depicted as a merman, with the upper body of a human and the lower body of a fish. Triton often being accompanied with a conch shell that he would blow into like a horn that he could control the waves with, and perhaps the most comparable of all the Greek legends depicting mermaids is the mythology of sirens, who were half-women, half-fish entities who would dwell around caves and cliff faces of islands, who would try to lure in unsuspecting sailors, only for them to meet their demise. However, sirens would be originally described as half-human, half-bird entities, rather than fish, and over time into Roman and medieval time periods, the stories of sirens would morph into those of half-women, half-fish entities, and even during this time, they were not commonly affiliated as mermaids. The first example we have in literary works of a siren being described as a traditional mermaid would be in the 8th century AD in the Liber Monstorium, a literary work acting as a collection of tales of extraordinary monsters. In this collection of works, it would describe sirens as quote-unquote sea girls with the body of a maiden but have scaly fishes' tails. Now, while perhaps the Greek legends are the most well-known, a couple other cultures and countries also have their own interpretations of the mermaid legend. You have various different mermaid legends originating in Scotland, Ireland, Germany, China, Africa, Brazil, New Zealand, and even South Korea all have some sort of iteration of the mermaid legend. Now, there is no doubt that there must be an origin for all these stories. Whether or not they were based off of and grew from these very early legends dating back to the Babylonians remains a possibility. However, it also makes you ask the question on whether or not it could be possible that there is a physical creature out there that could be responsible for these legends. But now that we have the rough history of mermaids and the folklore and legends associated with them, let's talk about the documented sightings of mermaids throughout history. Now, let's of course work our way through history here a little bit and start at the 1400s. Now, I did find some sightings that predated the 1400s, but they kind of tethered more along the line of folklore rather than seeing something that was kind of, like a documented sighting or someone attesting to seeing something that they could not explain. But nevertheless, let's start in 1403. Now, in 1403, an encounter with a mermaid would supposedly take place off of the Dutch coast. This sighting in particular would be written about in a book that would be published over 2 centuries later in 1635 by a man named John Swan, and the book was titled Speculum Mundi. Now, as this sighting and story goes, in 1403, a mermaid would wash ashore along the Dutch coast after swimming through a broken dike along the ocean. The mermaid would be found by a group of local women and their servants. Now, they would attempt to befriend and domesticate this mermaid by taking it home and feeding it a variety of dairy products and meat and such. They would give her clothing and tried to keep her in their home. However, the mermaid would attempt to make a run for it numerous times, back out into the sea. However, they would be caught every time, and after numerous failed attempts, the mermaid decided to stay with these women for roughly 15 years until the mermaid would eventually pass away. This story is also a little folklorish, but it describes more a direct story in an encounter as opposed to a vague description left behind in a historical text. However, let's jump ahead to 1493, and this would be where the infamous encounter by Christopher Columbus would take place. Now, Columbus would supposedly sight 3 mermaids while sailing throughout Hispaniola in 1493. He would describe them the following within his journals, and I quote, "They were not as beautiful as they are painted, although to some extent they have a human appearance in the face." And Christopher Columbus also stated that they appeared more masculine than in photos depicted them as. Columbus would state as well that he had sighted similar creatures in his travels around Africa. It is, however, widely regarded that what Columbus saw in the Caribbean were not mermaids, but rather manatees, and that is what he confused them for. Now, it is hard to say for certain, however, the manatee theory will come back up later when we discuss theories about mermaids. Now, let's jump ahead to 1608. Explorer Henry Hudson, who at this point was on an expedition through the Arctic Circle in either the Norwegian or Barents Sea, would claim that 2 of his men would claim to see a mermaid in the waters around their boat. Hudson would write the following, and I quote, "2 crew members, Thomas Hiles and Robert Rayner, sighted a mermaid at 7507 north and shouted at the rest of the crew to come and look. From the navel upwards her back and breast were like a woman's, as they say that saw her. Her body as big as one of ours, her skin very white and long hair hanging down behind, of color black. In her going down they saw her tail, which was like the tail of a porpoise and speckled like a mackerel." Jump ahead again to 1614. Captain John Smith, probably most of you know John Smith strictly from his affiliation with Pocahontas, would claim to see a mermaid off the coast of Massachusetts. And this is what John Smith would write about his sighting, and I quote, "The upper part of her body perfectly resembled that of a woman, and she was swimming about with all possible grace near the shore. It had large eyes, rather too round, a finely shaped nose, a little too short, well-formed ears, rather too long, and her green hair imparted to her an original character by no means unattractive." Now, jump ahead again to the 1700s, and now this sighting in particular is mostly rumor, but I was able to see throughout my research that the infamous pirate Edward Teach, aka more commonly referred to as Blackbeard, would state that he would have numerous sightings with mermaids throughout his travels along the Caribbean. It is rumored, however, that Blackbeard avoided mermaid-infested waters and documented these in his logbook. However, take all of this with a grain of salt, because I seemingly could not find anything to prove this claim or actual excerpts from his journal entries of any encounters with mermaids or mermen. Jump ahead again, almost another century, to 1797. In 1797, a Scottish schoolteacher named William Munro would be walking along the shore of Sandside Bay when he would see a figure that he believed to be a mermaid. He would state in a letter to a friend in Glasgow, and I quote, "My attention was arrested by the appearance of a figure resembling an unclothed human female, sitting upon a rock extending into the sea, and apparently in the action of combing its hair, which flowed around its shoulders, and of a light brown color, the cheeks ruddy, the eyes blue, the mouth and lips of a natural form, resembling those of a man. The teeth I could not discover, as the mouth was shut. The breasts and abdomen, the arms and fingers of the size in which the hands were employed, did not appear to be webbed, but as to this, I am not positive." Now, this letter would later be featured in the Times, a newspaper based out of London, England, in 1809. However, now let's jump ahead, this time to the story that we started today's episode with, and that being the sighting of the Japanese soldiers stationed on the Kai Islands in 1943. Now, what these Japanese soldiers were claiming to see did not sound or seem like your traditional mermaid. Now, for a quick background, the Kai Islands are located in the southeastern portion of Indonesia within the Molucca island chain. The Kai Islands resemble something more along the lines of a honeymoon destination, straight out of a postcard or tourism brochure, rather than a place of a supposed mass sighting of strange aquatic beings. Now, in 1943 in particular, these soldiers would come forward and claim to have sightings of these beings down by the beaches and in small pools and lagoons around the island. These humans were described as roughly 150 centimeters tall, about 5 feet for us Americans. They had a human-like face, spines on the top of their heads, with a mouth like a carp. The skin was a pale pink in color, and instead of having the tail of a fish, like the mermaid legend is almost synonymous for, they were described as having 2 arms and 2 legs. These beings seemed very skittish to the soldiers, as one soldier would recall having an encounter with one of these beings down by the beach late at night, where one would catch his attention out of the corner of his eye. He originally thought that it was a child, and when he looked closer, he could make out the facial features of the creature, and that is when things did not add up. It looked human enough, but it was very clearly not human. When this creature realized that it had gotten the attention of the soldier, it would make its way from the beach back into the ocean rapidly and dive into the water and not be seen again. Now, not to sidetrack here, for some reason, the whole description of these fish people is making me think of the Mirelurk Kings from Fallout. Don't know why, but let me know in the comments if you agree with me, and if you've also played Fallout at some point in time and you know what I'm talking about. The Mirelurk Kings, they kind of stand there and they shoot the sonic blast at you, and they're kind of like either green or red, and they have all the gills and the spiny fins on them and things like that. That's instantly what this reminded me of. It also vaguely reminded me of the Loveland Frogman, which I have not shockingly done an episode on. I kind of find myself running around into different stories that I'm kind of shocked I haven't covered yet. Maybe the Loveland Frogman will come up in a later episode, but this story also kind of reminded me of the Loveland Frogman, so maybe I'll cover that at some point. Now, as it turns out, the indigenous people of the Kai Islands knew about these creatures very well, and they even had a name for them. They called them orang-ikan, translating to human fish, which that's pretty spot on, if you ask me. Now, these indigenous peoples would tell the Japanese that sometimes every now and again they would catch one within their fishing nets, and if they did, they would alert the soldiers so they could see one up close. One evening, a sergeant with the surveillance team, Taro Horiba, would be summoned by the chief of the local village. The locals would tell Horiba that an orang-ikan was found dead, washed up on the beach earlier that day, and the chief was summoning him so he could have a look for himself. Now, Horiba would travel to the chief's home to investigate this creature, and when Horiba would finally make it to the chief's home, he could not even begin to fully comprehend what he was seeing. Now, Horiba would describe the orang-ikan as a little over 5 feet tall and having long red shoulder-length hair. The face of the creature was human, but also had a striking ape-like features with a broad forehead, short nose, small ears, and a lipless mouth that was very wide, and Horiba described this like a carp's mouth. Now, inside of the mouth was not teeth like we would compare to human teeth, but rather numerous small needle-like teeth. The hands and feet of the creature were webbed in between the fingers and toes. Now, Horiba would eventually return to Japan and would tell his friends and colleagues about this story, but that went about as well as you would expect it to. No one believed him, and many questioned why he didn't take any photos of the creature while he was on the Kai Islands. The local villagers seemed to have lived alongside these creatures for quite a while. However, the belief of them by the broader public seems to be the subject of immense ridicule. However, it is just a story. Since Sergeant Horiba did not get any physical evidence of these fish people or of the orang-ikan, we are left to wonder about what he and the other soldiers stationed on the Kai Islands actually could have seen. Now let's jump ahead again to 1967, when there was a mass reported sighting from a ferry going through the waters around British Columbia, Canada, when witnesses would describe seeing a blonde-haired woman seemingly topless with the body of half a woman and half a porpoise lying along the rocky coastline. However, this sighting is widely regarded as a hoax, and that this was simply a woman in a costume, and the picture taken of the supposed mermaid would kind of corroborate that. It very much looks like a human with a fake mermaid tail, but that didn't stop people from spreading the story, and even some witnesses aboard the ferry who have claimed to have this sighting claimed that she was eating a whole raw salmon while leisurely laying on the banks of the ocean in British Columbia. Now, it is hard to say without absolute certainty, but I would chalk this one up to a never-ending bin of mermaid hoaxes, some of which we will dive into here a little bit later. Now, let's jump ahead again to 1998 in Kauai Point, Hawaii. A diver named Jeff Liker would claim that he and others would have an encounter with what would go on to be dubbed the Kauai Point Mermaid. Liker, owner of Jack's Diving Locker, which from what I could find is a scuba and snorkeling guiding tour and excursion service based out of Kona, Hawaii. Now, as the story goes, Jeff would be 20 miles off the coast when he and 10 other people that he had on the boat at the time would witness a nude woman swimming with a pack of dolphins. The woman was miraculously able to keep up with the dolphins and even make a series of leaps and bounds into the air and out of the water. When this woman would leap out of the water is when Jeff would see that her lower half of her body was that of a fish and was not human. The woman would not surface again after that second dive. Now, it would be a short time later, roughly about an hour or so as the story goes, and Jeff would be snorkeling and capturing photos of underwater life with a camera, and at the time he was with 6 other divers when he would feel something brush past him. Now, the following is his quote to the Weekly World News, and I quote, "About an hour later, we arrived at the point and we were diving. I was photographing some colorful fish with my underwater camera. Suddenly, I felt something brush against my right leg. She shot by me like a streak of lightning, then turned and came back past me, swimming the other way. I just aimed the camera and started snapping pictures. I kept shooting as she broke for the surface and swam away." Now, Jeff just happened to get a photograph of this mermaid, and it conveniently enough does not show any distinguishable facial features or anything of the sort, merely the generic silhouette of a traditional mermaid. Now, the reason I coughed before I said Weekly World News is because Weekly World News is a tabloid news source, possibly known for being the magazine on the end of the store rack where you were growing up as a kid that would make outrageous claims like Bill Clinton knows where the lizard people live, or Elvis to be reincarnated, or some random shit like that. It's 99% fake garbage. Now, if you ask me, this is some silly ploy to try and drum up some business, and I have to imagine it worked. The story is featured on the website for Jack's Diving Locker, and although it doesn't seem to be super prominent on the website, I was able to find that it does seem like business during this time was expanding, and 10 years after this quote-unquote sighting, they would seemingly outgrow their second shot because business was so good. And it would stand to reason that this sighting would have generated significant buzz for them, whether it was fake or real, and that this was, I think this is fake, quite honestly, and that this was merely a hoax generated for some additional bucks, and like I said, from what I was able to find, it seems like it worked. Then, in 2009, in Kiryat Yam, Israel, numerous independent eyewitnesses would come forward and claim that they were seeing a mermaid off the shore at around sunset. A man by the name of Shlomo Cohen was supposedly one of the first to see the figure, and he stated, and I quote, "I was with friends when suddenly we saw a woman laying in the sand in a weird way. At first I thought she was just another sunbather, but when we approached, she jumped into the water and disappeared. We were all in shock because we saw she had a tail. At least 5 of us saw it, and we couldn't believe it." Now, more and more people would supposedly have claimed to come forward, all seeing the figure of a young girl who was half woman and half fish, down by the shore just before nightfall. Eventually, these continued sightings created a genuine buzz in the area, and the Israeli government put forward a $1 million reward for anyone providing proof of the mermaid's existence. However, the wrench in this story is money. A council spokesperson named Nadi Zilberman stated, and I quote, "People are telling us they are sure they have seen the mermaid, and they are all independent of each other." He'd continue and said, "I believe if there really is a mermaid, then so many people will come to Kiryat Yam. A lot more money will be made than $1 million. This article was courtesy of ABC News. Now, my first reaction to this was, sir, you said the quiet part out loud. because I think that this is a tourism scheme, and by all accounts from what I was able to find in my research, it seemed to work. Now, some other theories that were proposed, like the idea that this was some type of mutant dolphin caused by severe pollution in the area, that also seems to be a stretch, although it's actually kind of a fun theory to think about. But the fact that the $1 million reward was never claimed shows to me that this was a local ploy, probably orchestrated by the local government to try and increase tourism revenue. Now let's jump ahead a few more years to 2012. In Zimbabwe, rumors started to emerge from dam workers working on the Gokwe Dam that they were being harassed by mermaids, preventing them from doing their work and installing a water pump at the dam. Workers were also claiming that machinery within the dam started breaking without explanation, and that the workers started to blame mermaids. Now, a similar incident would also be reported at the Osborne Dam, also in Zimbabwe, from workers who were sent to unblock some pipes at the dam that had mysteriously clogged, only for the divers to come back up to the surface and vow to never go down there again. Water Resources Minister Samuel Sipepa Nkomo, and I hope I said that right, Samuel Sipepa Nkomo would state the issues happening at the Gokwe Dam at a Senate meeting. He would include the stories of coming out of the Osborne Dam as well, and stated that he did not personally believe in mermaids, but many within the country do. He thought that perhaps the divers at Osborne Dam were scared because of their spirituality, and Nkomo would state, and I quote, "We even hired whites thinking that our boys did not want to work, but they also returned saying they would not return to work there again." And that's an actual quote, which I mean, I don't know if you can phrase it like that, but oh well, I guess. Now, like I mentioned, some in Zimbabwe are deeply spiritual and claim and believe that many drownings are responsible for mermaids. Some natives to Zimbabwe claim that mermaids are a section of the overall group of water spirits that worship the devil and oppose God, and state that to appease them and protect yourselves and others, that rituals must be done at the bodies of water they are claimed to inhabit. Now, in regards to the collection of sightings that we do have, I am absolutely sure that there are some that I missed in my research, as the mermaid issue is one that has been around pretty much since the dawn of mankind and the numerous religions that each culture has had over centuries of time. Now, I think inherently humans are fascinated with the mermaid story because it is one in which that seemingly translates through multiple different cultures, religions, and demographics, and is easily one of the most recognizable forms of a folklore creature that we have on planet Earth. Coupled with the inclusion of the mermaid in numerous large-scale productions of media, TV, movies, video games, and even books, makes the legend even more widespread and makes the image of the mermaid pretty much known by everyone. Like I said, though, there are absolutely more sightings out there than what I listed in today's episode, but these were just some of the more notable ones. Now that we've talked about some sightings, let's talk about some hoaxes. Now, I will go over my entire thoughts on the sightings and the overall mermaid issue here in a little bit, but I also want to debunk some mermaid myths, even though they kind of already are debunked. Now, perhaps the most notably is the Fiji mermaid. Now, many people are probably aware of the Fiji mermaid. It is the supposed mummified corpse of a half-monkey, half-fish-like creature that was caught off the coast of Fiji and was popularized by traveling showman P.T. Barnum when he showed the original Fiji mermaid back in 1842. Since then, many different iterations have been made of the Fiji mermaid, kind of piggybacking off the success of the original. Now, the original Fiji mermaid disappeared from Barnum's collection entirely and has not been found. However, it is widely believed that the original Fiji mermaid was a victim of a fire, as numerous fires over the course of history have occurred at Barnum's collection of odd show creatures and items. Now, the Fiji mermaid is very much a fake and not real at all, and is rather the body of half a monkey sewed to the body of half a fish. So it is very not real. But it does rather show the lengths to which people will go to help spread the mermaid legend and capitalize off of its name, image, and likeness to make a quick buck. Now, another hoax I want to talk about very briefly is not necessarily a mermaid per se, but rather something, again, made by humans, actually during the times of the Old Dutch, to try and spread the belief of mermaids, fairies, and other sea-residing spirits. Now, they are referred to as Jenny Hanivers, as they are called, and they are carved corpses of skates and rays, and then preserved to give them facial features like eyes, mouths, and even small legs. The name Jenny Havener basically being a bastardized version of the Belgian word Jeune d'Anvers, meaning young girl in person of Antwerp. Now, while Jenny Haveners have also been fake, it touches on what I kind of echoed this whole episode, and that being taking advantage of folklore and religious belief to influence the masses or to try to get some financial incentive. However, now that we have talked about the sightings, some hoaxes, kind of our folklore or overall legend, let's move into theories about mermaids. Now, the first theory I want to talk about is real, but to a fault, and let me explain what I mean by this. Now, before I jump right off the deep end and claim that mermaids are real, that is why I specifically put down real to a fault as the name of this theory. Now, this theory would include that some iterations of mermaids are real, or could be real, while others are faked. This, of course, would include the sighting in British Columbia, Canada, and Israel, and the sightings I would like to hone in on rather than kind of the one in Israel or British Columbia. I'd like to talk about specifically the 1943 sightings in the Kai Islands and the 2012 Zimbabwe sightings. To me, those sightings have more meat to them, especially the Kai Island sightings of the orang-utan. Now, I think that there is enough substance for the orang-utan for that to be almost its own thing and not connected with the more traditional examples of mermaids that we have. However, I am more likely to believe that story because of the documentation that we do have. The only unfortunate thing that we don't have is the inclusion of any photographs of these creatures. However, Indonesia and Southeast Asia has had a history of small humanoid adjacent beings for a very long time. In 2003, the discovery of the Homo floresiensis, aka the Hobbit people, that were a very specific group of human evolution, and the discovery of the Homo floresiensis kind of started people asking the broader question of what distant human ancestors looked like. Now, these small humans that were only described to have a max height of roughly 3.5 feet tall lived 50,000 years ago. And they were obviously discovered in Indonesia, and to this day, this is the only place where their bones have been discovered. So we don't know kind of the relation between the early human history and how the Homo floresiensis played into that, but this is very close where the discovery of the Hobbit people, as they are referred to, and kind of this legend of these half-human, half-fish, 5-foot-tall creatures are. You're in the same neck of the woods, so it's hard to not think about the two. Now, in addition to the orang-utan, even though they are a little taller than the Homo floresiensis, you also have stories out of nearby Sumatra of the orang pendek, a small humanoid ape-like creature similar to Bigfoot, just a heck of a lot smaller. Now, if any type of undiscovered humanoid creature could exist, it is very possible it could be here in Sumatra in Indonesia. Now, this theory, not to get off track, is that mermaids could be real. Maybe the Kai Islands mermaids are real, or the orang-utan could be real, but maybe mermaids are real. But what I'm getting at is maybe just not traditional mermaids, and rather these aquatic human fish-like people, like in the Kai Islands, and maybe water spirits, like in Zimbabwe, that seem more paranormal rather than physical, and that our brains commonly associate these humanoid aquatic entities as quote-unquote mermaids, because that is what we recognize them as through centuries of recognition, through culture and religion. I know that's a very loaded theory, but I really like that theory. Now, let's move into our second theory, called the manatee theory. Now, perhaps one of the more widely publicized theories that we have, especially with Christopher Columbus's sighting, is that rather than being a mermaid, what these explorers saw, it was rather manatees, or different variations of sea cows. Now, at first glance, they have a tail, a rather unusual face and body shape that likens them to more of a grayish blob that could be mistaken for something more along the lines of a creature rather than a full-blown mermaid. Now, manatees would be very much new to Columbus, as manatees are not present in the waters of Spain, so he truly would not know what he was looking at when he saw a manatee for the first time. Now, in the case of the sighting of Henry Hudson and his crew in the Arctic Circle in 1608, what they described to me sounds much more like a narwhal rather than a manatee, and I kind of get to that point because they said the tail was like a porpoise, but speckled like a mackerel. If you look at the tail and body of a narwhal, it's kind of a very speckled gray in color. However, the only wrinkle in that is that um, narwhals have been known to exist for a long time, even before kind of Henry Hudson, kind of explored these waters. Narwhals were known. They actually, when narwhals were hunted, they would pass off the narwhal horn as a unicorn horn during this time period. However, to me, Henry Hudson was an English explorer. He was not native to the Arctic regions in which narwhals reside in, so maybe this theory is possible that Henry Hudson saw the back half of a narwhal and mistakenly thought it, or his sailors saw the back half of a narwhal and instantly thought that it was a mermaid as opposed to something that they would have traditionally seen before. Now, in the case of John Smith, manatees have been known to come as far north as New England during the summer months, so it is very possible again that John Smith saw a manatee and instantly associated what he saw with a beautiful woman as opposed to rather the humble sea cow. Now, the next theory I want to talk about, and this one's a little bit out left field, but it's kind of fun to think about, is the government cover-up theory. Now, this theory doesn't hold much water in my eyes, no pun intended, although I would like to think that maybe it is true in some capacity. Now, in my research, I have often come up upon claims with no facts to back it up, and when I research it, I also, shockingly, can't find any more research to support the claims. But many online seem to claim that mermaids are real, and that world governments cover up their existence like aliens or other monsters or creatures out there for some unknown reason. Now, again, these are claims, and there is no evidence to support them that I've been able to find. However, it is fun to think about, but again, I always circle back to this, there's no evidence. If the government, was covering up the existence of mermaids, what would be the end goal? To protect them from hunting? To exploit them for some unknown reason? Perhaps they can communicate, and they can provide insight into ancient peoples and undiscovered ocean life, and the government wants to hide that from people. Who knows? But until we have some evidence to support this theory, it is exactly that, just a theory. Now, this last theory I want to talk about is the fake, a figment of folklore theory, and that this would be that mermaids are simply products of folklore and religious influence, and that over time water spirits and gods slowly morphed into legends about mermaids and underwater humanoid figures that lure sailors off of boats or things like that. Rather, I look at that and say that we have had numerous examples of sea monsters back during those times because we did not fully understand what was out there in our own oceans at the time. Perhaps the most famous example would be that of the Kraken, which is proven to be true to an extent with the discovery of the giant squid, albeit the stories of the Kraken usually involve a lot more boat destruction. Now, I feel like humans have spread stories about things that we cannot fully explain for the longest time. Perhaps sailors mysteriously vanishing on the high seas spread the tales that they were lured into the water below by a stunning seductress of the sea. Couple that in with sightings of creatures like the manatee, whose animal group includes multiple different breeds that exist on multiple different areas of the planet, it is very easy to grow a legend in a folktale. Now, in my own personal opinion, I think the mermaid legend, or I guess mermaid sightings, are a combination of everything. You cannot just blanketly associate one theory to them. I think that there are some mermaid sightings that are made up for obviously financial reasons, and they're influenced by culture, they're influenced by religion, they're influenced by a whole number of different things. Pop culture, they are all influenced and they kind of all piggyback on each other in the overall mermaid legend. Do I think that some example of maybe the mermaid legend is real, like the orangutan? Yes, I do think that there's a possibility in that. However, do I also think that mermaids were associated, or manatees, could be confused with mermaids because mermaids were a recognizable folklore figure, and then you saw a manatee, and then you just instantly played the word association? That, to me, I also very firmly believe. Do I think the stories of sirens and mermaids luring sailors to a watery death could be perhaps explained differently to kind of more or less the products of maybe a rogue wave? Sailors discovering a boat with nobody on it, the whole ghost ship idea, when in reality, it could have been a rogue wave that swept all of these sailors off the boat. They all drowned. They were never discovered. And these boats floating around, or you lose a crew member out at sea. It was, oh, nope, the wave didn't get him. The rough weather didn't get him. It was a siren that lured him into the water. So I think that over time, humans have created legends to help justify very normal, common things. And I do feel like that has piggybacked into the mermaid legend as a whole. Overall, the mermaid legend is one that is very hard to categorize, in my personal opinion, because I think you have so many different influences piggybacking on this one overall figure. And that's, like I mentioned in the open, this figure is immensely popular because we've had centuries and centuries of historical documentation of half human, half fish like people. It is impossible for humans. You say mermaid, people know instantly what you're talking about. You have children knowing what mermaids are from, movies like The Little Mermaid and things like that. Humans are instantly exposed to, at a very young age and continuously throughout the extent of their lives, to the idea of mermaids and half human, half fish people. And of course, they're popularized now, but humans in an extent are captivated by things that they don't fully understand, and mermaids are one of them. They exist on that plane where it very much sits in reality and fantasy, and we so want to believe that it's true, even though we don't really have much evidence to say that it is true. And I think because of that, you have people going to the extent to create hoaxes and fibs and making up stories that mermaids are real, and creating fake documentation or fake videos or things like the Fiji mermaid or Jenny Haveners to try to justify the belief in something when there is no evidence to support the belief in something. So I think that, again, the mermaid theory overall is a very complex one, and it is very hard to pick one side of it, but I think my overall opinion is all of it. I think all of the theories are real, all to a certain extent, and they all play a different piece of the pie, a different piece of the puzzle when it comes to mermaids. So I believe every theory in this, maybe except for the government cover-up. Although, maybe there is another part of the mermaid legend when it comes to government cover-up that I was not able to find, that somebody is able to find. So if there is evidence out there that the government is covering up the existence of mermaids for some other reason, and you have evidence to back this up, and you have maybe articles and things like that, feel free to send me them down in the comments. I say all the time that I am a one-man band. I do all the recording, editing, research. It's just me. So sometimes things slip through the cracks and I do miss things. So if you do find anything in regards to mermaids and the government and covering things up, absolutely send that to me. I'd be absolutely ecstatic, and I will definitely check it out. But with that all being said, that is going to do it for me on this week's episode into mermaids. I hope you all appreciated it. This was a very fun one to research, as I had not really done a whole lot of digging into mermaids before this week's episode, and I had no idea the full extent that mermaids, or at least mermaid-esque figures, have had on legends and mythology and folklore since pretty much the beginning of humankind. And I never realized that, and now I feel I'm very more knowledgeable on the whole mermaid genre as I was before going into this week's episode. But again, that is going to do it for me on this week's episode over mermaids. I hope you all appreciated it, and I will see you all on the next one.